Ed. He's welcome to Module 10. This one's going to be on formative assessment, and that's what's really great is over the next 2 weeks we're going to be talking about assessment, and it's kind of nice that we actually have the opportunity to separate these two, formative and the summative assessment, and kind of draw a comparison between the two. They're very different, yet they're very similar, and they kind of overlap with one another. And that's one of the things that I want you to be thinking about. And I'm going to ask you if you, as you enter the formative assessment and start engaging in some of the material, that you just be filing this away. That we're going to be drawing a comparison of these two in the discussion next week. That is the summative assessment discussion. We're actually going to be talking about, okay, well, you know, how are they similar, how are they different, how do they overlap, can one become the other, type of thing. So just kind of bear that in mind as you're going through. Now, formative assessment, you know, what makes them different from summative, and this is what we're going to talk about, of course, in the next 2 weeks, and it says, you know, summative assessment is the one that we're most familiar with, right? And that is one that that focuses on how is a student doing at a given milestone within a course or a learning experience, right? So when we think of a summative assessment, we usually think of a term paper, we think about an exam or whatever. It's that milestone, right? It's at the end of a module. It's at the end of the first half of a 14-week course, right? We want to know how the student is doing up to this endpoint, or, you know, or milestone, so to speak. The difference between summative and formative is formative happens within the learning experience itself, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to see where is this student within the progress of the learning experience. All right, and what we're doing with the formative assessment is kind of like what nurses and doctors do with patients, right? They kind of do these diagnostics. Right, they take the pulse of their patients. They take their blood pressure within a given treatment. That's to find out how they're doing, and that's exactly what we're doing with formative assessment. We're finding out how they're doing. So if we, you know, kind of think of an example, you know, if we're in a lecture hall or whatnot, and you know, a teacher is giving a lecture of some kind or doing a presentation or whatever, we always get those types of questions like, "Oh, so what is the difference between formative and summative assessment?" Question mark, right? And what's happening is the instructor is taking the pulse of his or her audience to see, okay, well, how am I doing? How did I do at defining this thing? Are the students getting it? Right? Maybe she may call on one of the students and say, could you please just, how would you define summative assessment? Right? And then the student would be chiming back with that. It's kind of a taking of the pulse, a formative assessment. So that's kind of where we're going with that. There actually, within formative assessment, there's actually a couple of varieties of formative assessment. And Black and William actually, they're in the reading this week. They're the kind of the leading researchers on formative assessment, at least what I've seen. They're really well recognized in their study of formative assessment, and they just define formative assessment as having two things. One is that it's directive, where the feedback shows the students what they need to fix or revise in order to be back on track. Okay, so that's what they would say with that. And in the first phase, and then the second one is the facilitative one. All right, and the facilitative one is where students are actually guided into becoming familiar and proficient at making their own revisions and their own conceptualizations. All right, now what does that mean? I think it kind of means if we do a really good job of using formative assessment and modeling formative assessment and modeling the types of questions that one should be asking themselves within a learning experience, we're actually training our students to be using those types of questions in their own thinking. And so they become more independent thinkers, and they become more apt to conceptualize and understand things better. So that's the kind of place that I really get excited about. Is that part where we're talking about, can we help alter a student's behavior so that they're asking the right questions? It's really kind of an amazing thing. But that's the deep part of formative assessment. Now, you've been doing formative assessment all along, right? It's this whole thing of taking the pulse and finding out how well we're doing. The concept checks are my formative assessment strategy. And that brings up an interesting point, too. Formative assessment is not an easy thing to do in an online situation, as you can probably imagine, right? We have to be super intentional about doing this. It's really kind of easy in a face-to-face course because you can just ask out a question or whatever at any given time. You can also kind of take your diagnostics just by observing, right? I had one professor actually that I worked with a couple of years ago. He was a really funny guy. He says, you know, his strategy for formative assessment was, am I getting the 3 thump rule? And that is, am I getting 3 thumps on the desk with his students because they're totally lost, right? So that's not really the greatest formative assessment strategy, but I mean, it's that kind of gives you an idea. I mean, you can do that very easily in a lecture situation, and you can just look at the direction of their eyes and so forth, and getting a reading of how well they're getting these things. But you're really going to be intentional in an online course and have places in there where you're doing the formative assessment. And the discussion board is a really good one. The concept checks are really good ones, and all of that. So keep that stuff in mind. And again, when you're thinking about formative assessment, you're thinking about, okay, well, how does this match up to the summative assessment one that I'm probably a little more familiar with, right? And then, of course, you're going to be asked in your final course to use some kind of a formative assessment strategy. You can use concept checks, but you don't have to, right? As long as you're satisfying the criteria of what a formative assessment is, right? And you know and understand what a formative assessment is, and you're actually putting it into practice in your course. It doesn't have to be a concept check. It can be something else. But it's just got to be clear that it is formative, all right? And so you'll be thinking about that. And again, you know, summative assessment for next week, and of course that's going to involve of creating a summative assessment along with a rubric to measure it as well. Okay, so have a wonderful Module 10, and we'll see you online. Bye-bye.